This is a restricted military command deck, not a public library for has-beens and tired old relics. Get out of the way. The words from Commander Valerius Thorn were not a request. They were a blade, sharpened with arrogance and intended to cut deep. The small cluster of junior officers and technicians on the bridge of the CNS Vigilance flinched, some offering a nervous, complicit chuckle. All eyes fell on the source of Thorn's irritation. A woman of indeterminate age, perhaps late 50s, dressed in plain, unadorned gray fatigues that bore no rank, no insignia, no hint of belonging. Her hair, a cascade of steel gray and silver, was pulled back in a simple, functional knot. She stood near a secondary tactical console, her attention utterly absorbed by a small, battered datapad she held in her hands, her posture one of quiet contemplation. She made no sound, offered no protest, her face a mask of placid neutrality as Thorn's verbal assault washed over her. He took her silence not as disciplined composure, but as the meekness of an inferior, a civilian contractor or a low-level analyst who had wandered into a space far above her clearance. He moved with the aggressive confidence of a man who believed the world was a stage for his authority. He needed to get to the main console, and she was in his direct path. Impatient, he placed a hand flat on her shoulder and shoved. It wasn't a violent act, but it was one of profound disrespect, an assertion of dominance meant to humiliate. The woman stumbled, her shoulder meeting the cold, metallic bulkhead of the corridor with a soft thud. She didn't cry out, didn't even look at him. She simply braced herself, her eyes never leaving the glowing screen of her datapad, her thumb making a slow, deliberate, scrolling motion. A flicker of something ancient and powerful passed through the eyes of the ship's captain, Elias Vance, who observed the entire exchange from his command chair on the upper deck. He saw not a frail woman being pushed aside, but the unmistakable, rock-steady stance of a warrior absorbing a blow without breaking focus. He saw the way she planted her feet, a subtle shift of weight that was pure muscle memory, a technique taught only in the most brutal and elite special forces training decades ago. The commander, blind to this nuance, sneered in satisfaction. But Captain Vance knew. He knew that Commander Thorn hadn't just shoved a random observer. He had laid hands on a living legend, a ghost of the fleet, and in doing so, had triggered a chain of events that would shatter his world and redefine the very meaning of respect for everyone on that bridge. If you believe that true strength is found not in the volume of the voice, but in the weight of one's actions, type competence in the comments below. The tension on the bridge of the Vigilance was already a palpable thing, a low thrum of energy that vibrated through the deck plates. They were in the final phase of Fleet Exercise Centurion, a massive war game designed to test the 7th Battle Group's response to a sudden, overwhelming enemy assault. Commander Thorn was the watch officer, the maestro of this simulated symphony of destruction, and he conducted his orchestra of technicians and tactical officers with a flair for the dramatic and a disdain for anything that deviated from his precise, aggressive doctrine. His world was one of clear hierarchies, of polished boots and crisp salutes, and the quiet, unassuming woman in gray was a discordant note in his perfect composition. He saw her as an administrative auditor, sent from some dusty sector command to tick boxes and write reports, completely oblivious to the high-stakes, controlled chaos of a frontline command information center. Her silence was, to him, a sign of intellectual vacancy, her focused study of the datapad, an irrelevant distraction. The shove was a physical manifestation of his philosophy. Things that do not belong must be moved. What he failed to comprehend was the sheer scale of his misjudgment. The woman, whose name he had not even bothered to learn, was not merely observing the exercise. She was its architect. The datapad she held contained not administrative notes, but the source code for the entire simulation, the ghost in the machine that he and his entire crew were fighting against. She was reading the flow of the battle not as it appeared on the holographic displays, but as a series of complex algorithms and predictive models, seeing 10 moves ahead, understanding the enemy's logic because she had written it herself. Her presence was unannounced, a deliberate choice to gauge the raw, unfiltered performance of her command staff under pressure. She had chosen the path of anonymity to get a pure, untainted reading of her fleet's readiness. The gray fatigues were a form of camouflage, designed to make her invisible, to invite the very assumptions that Commander Thorne had so readily supplied. As the junior officers exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort masked by a veneer of military discipline, the woman finished her scroll. She tapped the corner of her data pad twice, a small, almost inaudible chime echoing in the sudden quiet. On the main tactical display, 1,000 light-years away in the simulated Aldrin sector, a new variable entered the equation. A previously unknown energy signature bloomed on the screen, a harbinger of the true test that was about to begin. Thorne, puffing his chest out, turned back to his console, completely unaware that his act of casual contempt had just triggered the endgame. The ghost in the machine was no longer content to simply observe. The simulation had been challenging, a textbook example of a flanking maneuver by the designated Red Force. Thorne had handled it with competent, if predictable, aggression. He had anticipated their movements based on established doctrine, deploying his cruiser squadrons to intercept and his destroyer wings to screen the capital ships. It was a solid, by-the-book performance, one that would earn him a positive entry in his service record. But then the anomaly appeared. It wasn't a ship. It was a wave of cascading system failures. One by one, the tactical displays on the bridge began to flicker and die. Communications devolved into a storm of static. The targeting computers, the pride of the fleet, started spitting out gibberish, locking onto phantom targets or refusing to lock on at all. A wave of confusion washed over the bridge crew. This wasn't part of the exercise parameters. This was chaos. Thorne's confident demeanor began to crack. "Report," he barked, his voice a half-octave too high. "What is that? Is this a system malfunction? Get diagnostics on the line now." The technicians worked frantically, their fingers flying across their consoles, but they were chasing ghosts. The Red Force, no longer bound by predictable doctrine, exploited the chaos with brutal efficiency. Their simulated torpedoes began to strike home. Icons representing Alliance ships turned from green to a damning final red. The Vigilance itself was now targeted, alarms blaring with a genuine, unnerving urgency. It was in this crescendo of panic that the woman in gray finally moved. She didn't rush. Her movements were a study in economy, a ballet of pure, unadulterated competence. She set her old datapad down on a vacant console, the screen still glowing with lines of esoteric code. She walked calmly to the now-abandoned master tactical station, the one Thorne had been so desperate to reach. The young ensign manning it had recoiled, his face pale with panic, utterly overwhelmed. The woman gently placed a hand on his shoulder, not a shove, but a steadying, reassuring touch. "I have it, son," she said, her voice quiet but carrying an authority that cut through the noise like a laser. She slid into the seat, her hands hovering over the controls for a single, long moment. Her eyes were closed, as if she were listening to the rhythm of the battle, feeling the pulse of the dying ship around her. Then her hands descended. Her fingers didn't just type, they danced. They moved with a speed and precision that was hypnotic, a blur of motion that spoke of thousands upon thousands of hours of practice. She wasn't using the standard graphic interface that Thorne and his crew relied upon. Instead, she had bypassed it entirely, her fingers calling up a raw command line interface, a relic of a bygone era of naval computing that most active officers only read about in history texts. Lines of code, complex and elegant, scrolled across the screen at an impossible rate. She wasn't just countering the system failures. She was rewriting the simulation's core programming in real time. The cascading electronic warfare attack, the one that had crippled the entire bridge, was not just blocked. It was captured, analyzed, and turned back against its source. On the main holographic display, the Red Force ships suddenly found their own systems failing, their own communications dissolving into static. A collective gasp rippled through the bridge crew. Commander Thorne watched, his mouth agape, his face a canvas of disbelief. He didn't even recognize the command she was inputting. It was a dead language, a forgotten art. With the electronic threat neutralized, the woman turned her attention to the tactical situation. Her hands moved from the keyboard to the holographic control spheres. With a series of fluid, precise gestures, she began to move their remaining forces. It wasn't the standard, rigid doctrine Thorne had employed. It was something else entirely. She broke formations, sending single destroyers on what looked like suicide runs, only for them to execute flawless micro-jumps behind enemy lines, targeting weak points in their sensor grids. She used the gravity wells of nearby planets to slingshot cruisers into perfect firing positions, a maneuver so risky and requiring such precise calculations that it was deemed theoretically possible but practically suicidal in the Academy textbooks. She coordinated the fleet not as a collection of individual ships, but as a single, living weapon. Each movement was perfectly synchronized, each volley of fire timed to the microsecond to create overlapping fields of destruction. The Red Force, which had been on the verge of total victory, was now being systematically dismantled. It was a rout, a masterpiece, a complete and utter impossibility. In the space of 90 seconds, the entire battle had been reversed. The last Red Force battleship icon flickered and vanished from aboard. The blaring alarms were replaced by a profound, deafening silence. Every single person on the bridge, from the lowest-ranked technician to Captain Vance, stood frozen, their eyes locked on the small, gray-haired woman who now sat perfectly still, her hands resting calmly in her lap. The simulation was over. She had won. Thorne could only stammer, his arrogance vaporized and replaced by a cold, terrifying awe. That's not possible, he whispered to no one in particular. No one could do that. Captain Elias Vance rose slowly from his command chair, the aged leather groaning in the silence. His movements were deliberate, each step down the short flight of stairs to the main deck resonating with a gravity that drew every eye. He didn't look at Thorne. He didn't look at the stunned bridge crew. His gaze was fixed solely on the woman who now calmly powered down the master tactical station. The spell of shocked silence was broken by his voice, low and resonant, carrying the weight of his 50 years in the service. "Commander Thorne," he said, the words as cold and hard as the vacuum of space. "You will stand down and you will remain silent." Thorne, for the first time in his career, looked like a frightened child. He snapped his mouth shut, his face pale. Vance walked past him and approached the woman. He stopped a respectful 3 paces from her, his old eyes, which had seen battles both real and simulated, filled with a mixture of reverence and something that looked like nostalgia. "It has been a long time, Admiral," he said, his voice now imbued with a warmth that startled the crew. He then did something that no one on that bridge had ever seen a captain do for someone without visible rank. He drew himself up to his full height and executed a slow, perfect formal salute. It was not the perfunctory gesture of a subordinate to a superior. It was the salute of a warrior to his queen, an acknowledgement of a power and a history that transcended the simple insignia on a uniform. The woman finally looked up from the console, her calm gray eyes meeting Vance's. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "Elias," she said, her voice still quiet, "you've kept the vigilance in fine shape. A bit rigid in your tactical doctrine, but the ship is sound." The word Admiral hung in the air, an explosive charge waiting to detonate. Thorne's mind reeled, trying to process the impossible. An admiral? Here? Dressed like a mechanic? He started to take a step forward, a protest forming on his lips, a desperate attempt to reclaim the reality he understood. "Captain," he began, his voice cracking, "with all due respect, who is this woman? Her name is not on the watch roster. Her security clearance." Vance cut him off with a glare that could freeze plasma. He turned to his personal command console, his fingers tapping a few keys. "Bridge security, override protocol Vance, Omega 7. Access Fleet Command Central Registry. Search personnel file Rostova, Eva." The main holographic display, which moments before had shown a battlefield of dying stars and shattered fleets, now shimmered and resolved into a new image. It was an official Alliance fleet personnel file. A photograph appeared on the left. A much younger version of the woman, her face sharp and intense, her hair a raven black, wearing the crisp uniform of a newly minted ensign. But it was the text on the right that caused a wave of audible gasps to sweep across the bridge. The name read, Rostova, EVA. Below it, a single line of text glowed with impossible authority. Current rank, Fleet Admiral. The title alone was enough to make Thorne's blood run cold. There were only 4 fleet admirals in the entire Alliance Navy. They were demigods, figures of myth who commanded entire sectors of the galaxy from high-security, undisclosed locations. They did not visit individual ships, and they certainly did not do so unannounced and dressed in gray fatigues. But the credentials that scrolled down the screen were even more damning, a litany of legendary accomplishments that every cadet studied in history class. Unit, founder and first commander of Task Force Cerberus, the most elite special operations unit in fleet history. Combat engagements, Operation Nightfall, the Siege of Cygnus X-1, the Tartarus Anomaly. Each was a cornerstone of modern naval legend, battles so fierce and classified that the full details were still sealed. Medals, Star of Valor with Diamond Cluster, the Celestial Cross, the Praetorian Medal of Honor. Awards reserved for actions of such profound bravery and strategic genius that they altered the course of history. A final line appeared at the bottom, stark and chilling. Mission classifications, all operations designated Tier 1, eyes only, by order of the High Council. Thorne felt the deck plates shift beneath his feet. The woman he had insulted, the relic he had shoved against a wall, was not just an admiral. She was Eva Rostova, the architect of the Alliance's victory in the Great Dominion War. The ghost of Tartarus, who had single-handedly reprogrammed a captured enemy dreadnought in the middle of a battle and used it to destroy their fleet from within. The maneuvers she had just executed on the tactical display were not just brilliant. They were her signature, the legendary Rostova maneuver, that was considered a beautiful but unrepeatable work of art. Captain Vance let the information sink in, his silence a powerful indictment. He then turned his full attention to the now-trembling commander. Commander Thorne. Vance's voice was dangerously quiet. You asked for a clearance. Fleet Admiral Rostova's clearance is the very authority that allows this ship, this fleet, and you, to exist. You demanded to know who she was. She is the woman who wrote the book on modern naval warfare. The very book you so arrogantly claim to have mastered. You put your hands on her because you assumed. You assumed that rank is always worn on the collar. You assumed that competence makes noise. You assumed that greatness cannot exist in a quiet, unassuming form. Your assumptions, Commander, were a catastrophic failure of judgment, more dangerous than any enemy torpedo. He gestured to Rostova. This is Fleet Admiral Eva Rostova, Supreme Commander of the 7th Battle Group. This is her ship. This is her bridge. And you, Commander, are relieved of duty. The story of what happened on the bridge of the CNS Vigilance did not just spread, it detonated. It traveled through the ship's internal comms channels in hushed, reverent whispers. It jumped to other ships in the battle group via encrypted officer back channels. Within 48 hours, every soul in the 7th Fleet, from the lowest deck stoker to the highest-ranking squadron leader, knew the tale of the ghost on the bridge. They spoke of Commander Thorne's arrogance, his public act of disrespect serving as a cautionary tale against the sin of pride. But mostly, they spoke of Admiral Rostova, the legend of the quiet, gray-haired woman who had single-handedly defeated an unbeatable simulation with forgotten code and impossible maneuvers grew with each telling. The official recording of the 90-second engagement, stripped of all classified data, was leaked and became the most watched file on the fleet's internal networks. Young ensigns studied it with the devotion of acolytes, tracing her fluid commands, trying to comprehend the genius behind the Rostova maneuver. The Bridge of the Vigilance became a landmark, a hallowed space. The secondary console where she had left her datapad was unofficially nicknamed Rostova's Perch, and the bulkhead where Thorne had shoved her now bore a small, anonymously placed plaque that simply read, "Assumptions are the enemy." Valerius Thorne was not court-martialed. Admiral Rostova would not allow it. A court-martial would have been loud, public, and brutal, a form of institutional vengeance. Instead, her judgment was quiet, precise, and far more instructive. Thorne was stripped of his command and reassigned. He was sent to Deep Space Monitoring Station Epsilon 9, a lonely asteroid outpost on the furthest fringe of Alliance territory, a place of profound silence and solitude. His job was simple: to listen, to watch the endless, silent void, and report any anomalies. It was a humbling, ego-crushing assignment, designed to force him into a state of quiet observation, to teach him the value of seeing what is there, not what you expect to be there. For months, Thorne endured the isolation, the silence a constant reminder of his failure. He replayed the incident in his mind 1,000 times, the memory of his own sneering voice a source of burning shame. He had been so sure of himself, so certain of the world and his place in it. That certainty had been shattered by 90 seconds of silent, undeniable competence. He began to change. He started to listen to the faint whispers of deep space, not as noise, but as information. He learned to find patterns in the silence. He was humbled, broken, and then slowly, piece by piece, rebuilt. One day, 6 months into his assignment, a small, unmarked courier vessel docked at Epsilon 9. A single passenger disembarked, Admiral Eva Rostova, once again dressed in her simple gray fatigues. She met Thorne not in the sterile command center, but in the station's small, cramped mess hall. He stood rigidly at attention, his face a mask of shame, expecting a final, formal condemnation. He offered a salute, his movements stiff and awkward. Rostova did not return it. Instead, she gestured for him to sit. She poured 2 cups of standard issue, bitter coffee, and pushed one across the table to him. For a long time, they sat in silence, the only sound the low hum of the station's life support. Finally, she spoke, her voice as calm and steady as ever. "The void teaches a different kind of lesson. Valerius," she said, using his first name, a gesture that was both disarming and deeply personal. "Out here, there are no uniforms. No ranks. There's only the signal and the noise. The truth and the static that obscures it. The challenge is learning to tell them apart." She slid her old, battered datapad across the table. It was open to a file. It wasn't his service record or a letter of reprimand. It was a tactical analysis, a brilliant and insightful breakdown of a potential weakness in the fleet's new communication protocols. At the bottom of the document was the author's name, Commander Valerius Thorne. He had written it a week prior and sent it up the chain of command, expecting it to be lost in bureaucracy. "This is good work," Rostova said simply. "Clear, concise. You saw a vulnerability no one else did. You were listening." Thorne could only stare at her, overwhelmed. It was a test. The entire assignment had been a test. She hadn't sent him here to be punished, but to be reforged. She was not just a warrior and a strategist. She was a teacher, a cultivator of talent, even talent that had been corrupted by arrogance. She believed in redemption, not ruin. "Your time here is done," she said, standing up. "There's a transport arriving tomorrow. You have a new assignment. Deputy Tactical Officer on the CNS Defiant. Captain Vance specifically requested you." Thorne was speechless. The Defiant was the fleet's flagship, and Vance was now a Commodore. It wasn't a demotion. It was a second chance, a position of immense trust. He had been given the opportunity to earn back his honor, not because he was owed it, but because he had demonstrated he had learned the lesson of the silence. As she turned to leave, he finally found his voice. "Admiral, why?" She paused at the hatchway, looking back at him, her gray eyes holding a wisdom that seemed as vast as the void outside. "Because the fleet does not need more loud commanders, Valerius. It needs quiet professionals. It needs officers who understand that respect is a currency you earn with competence, not one you demand with volume. Go and be one of them." Years passed. The story of the ghost on the bridge became institutional folklore, a required lesson for every new class at the Alliance Naval Academy. Instructors would play the tactical recording, and a new generation of officers would watch in awe as the Rostova maneuver unfolded. The lesson wasn't about the specific tactics. It was about the profound truth the event revealed. It became a parable about the dangers of assumption and the immense power of quiet competence. The phrase, "don't pull a thorn," entered the naval lexicon, a sharp, immediate rebuke for any officer who displayed arrogance or judged a subordinate on superficial grounds. Conversely, to be called a gray operator became the highest form of compliment, a nod to Admiral Rostova's unassuming appearance and devastating effectiveness. It signified someone whose skills far outstripped their ego, someone who let their actions speak for them. The CNS Vigilance was eventually decommissioned, but the bridge was painstakingly preserved and turned into a museum, a permanent installation at the Academy. Cadets would walk the same deck plates, stand before the master tactical station, and touch the cool metal of the bulkhead, the small, anonymous plaque still there, a silent testament to the day, a living legend, reminded the entire fleet what true strength looked like. Valerius Thorn, under the mentorship of Commodore Vance, became one of the most respected tactical officers in the fleet. He was known for his calm demeanor, his meticulous attention to detail, and his unwavering habit of listening to the lowest-ranked technician with the same focused respect he would give an admiral. He never spoke of the incident at Epsilon 9, but he carried its lessons with him every day. He mentored young officers, and his first piece of advice was always the same: check your assumptions. The most dangerous person in the room is often the one you notice least. The legacy of Eva Rostova was not just in the battle she had won or the strategies she had designed. Her true legacy was in the cultural shift she had inspired. She had taught an entire generation of warriors that the true measure of a professional is not found in the shine on their boots or the volume of their commands, but in their unwavering composure under pressure, in the precision of their work, and the quiet dignity with which they carry their immense responsibilities. She had proven that in the silent calculus of competence, arrogance is always a liability, and humility is a force multiplier. True legacy is not a monument of stone you leave behind. It is a standard of conduct that continues forward in the actions of others. It is not a name etched on a plaque, but a lesson woven into the very fabric of an institution. Admiral Rostova's triumph was not in winning a simulated battle. It was in the lasting peace she created in the culture of her fleet, a peace built on the unshakable foundation of mutual respect. She demonstrated that authority is not a right of rank, but a responsibility granted to those who have proven their worth through discipline and action. Her silence was never a sign of weakness. It was the calm before the storm of her capability, a deliberate choice to observe, to analyze, and to act with devastating precision only when necessary. The universe is filled with noise, with the clamor of egos demanding attention, with the superficial judgments of those who see only the surface. But true power, the kind that can change the course of history, operates on a deeper frequency. It is the quiet hum of a perfectly maintained engine, the focused breathing of a master marksman, the unwavering calm of a leader who carries the weight of worlds on their shoulders without complaint. It is the profound truth that competence needs no announcement. It simply is. The greatest strength is not the ability to shout down your detractors, but the discipline to render their opinions utterly irrelevant through the sheer, undeniable force of your excellence. That is the lesson of the ghost on the bridge. It is a testament to the fact that in any room, in any crisis, the most powerful person is not the one making the most noise, but the one who has mastered the silence. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where a professional's actions define their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.